Hello and welcome to our stream here. Excuse me for this long waiting minutes. You can hear the presentation from Tim Gore now in a minute. Therefore, you just have to stay here. And if you want to, you can leave questions into our Mentimeter. So you have a link here, and feel free to ask. After after the presentation, we will have a short Q&A. Yes, and then I give to Tim.
Hi, thanks to everyone for joining this session. My name is Tim Gore. I lead the Low Carbon Circular Economy program at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, which is based in Brussels in Belgium, although I live and work from Stockholm in Sweden. And before joining IEEP this year, I worked for a long time with Oxfam International, and some of the work I will talk about today relates to work I began when I was with Oxfam and have continued now together with Oxfam and in my current role at IEEP. I will share my presentation. Okay. I hope you can see this okay. Participants can now see, yeah, good. Thumbs up from Philip, that's good sign. So what will I talk about today? Carbon inequality is the subject of this presentation. And I think in the previous session, you heard something about the unequal impacts of the climate crisis, which disproportionately affect, in particular, people in lower income countries around the world, and also tend to affect more those people who are more marginalized on lower incomes, actually in all countries. So even here in Europe, we know that it's more marginalized, more vulnerable communities who are harder hit by the climate crisis. So that's one part of the injustice of climate change with respect of the unequal impacts of the crisis. The other part of the injustice of climate change relates to the inequality in who is causing the problem. And that is what I will focus on in this presentation. And this is what we call carbon inequality. So the inequality in responsibility for emissions. And in particular, we can look, of course, in theory, one could look at the inequality in emissions between countries. We could look at it between companies. We could look at it between regions, between cities. Right now, we are looking in this presentation at the inequality of emissions between people, richer and poorer people around the world. So I will start by just introducing a few methodological issues or principles to give you a sense of how we derive the findings that I'm going to talk about. Then I will give you a quick recap of some of the work that we published last year, so that you have a sense of the big picture that we started to map out in those reports last year about the inequality in emissions between people that are richer and poorer wherever they live in the world. Then I will introduce you to our latest work, which we have just published during COP26 a couple of weeks ago, and give you a sense of what that is all about. And I will close with some reflections about the politics that relates to this issue and some of the policy areas which are starting to get more attention as a result of some of this work and this analysis. Okay. And as I think Philip mentioned, I'll be very happy to take your questions and comments, reflections also at the end. There should be time for that. And I really welcome your feedback at that point. So let's start with a few methodological questions. Don't be put off by the slightly busy slide. It's just to give you a flavor of some of the research which underpins this analysis. There are really two broad ways in which we can try to understand how emissions are distributed between people around the world, between those on richer and lower, higher and lower incomes. Two kind of broad ways of trying to do this. Perhaps the more intuitive way is the so-called bottom-up approach. And there are lots of research papers that are published in the academic literature that try to do it this way. And really what they do is that they take surveys from households, either in a particular country or a particular region, or indeed, where possible, from different countries all around the world. They take those surveys, and in those surveys, people are asked to fill out how much money they earn and what they spend their money on, how they typically consume in a given month or a certain period of time. And what this method does is it takes the results of those surveys, it applies emissions coefficients to the different types of expenditure which are identified in those surveys. So you say, well, if you buy this type of product, then it has an emissions footprint of X, and then you add up all of those emissions associated with the consumption, and you can organize that according to the incomes of different people in that country, in that region, or globally. So there are various attempts to do this in this bottom-up way, starting with household surveys and estimating the emissions that would be associated with the type of consumption which is reported by people in those household surveys. And that's a very good, robust method. But there are some problems or some limitations with it, mostly that there are not enough of these surveys. They are not conducted regularly enough, and they're not conducted in a systematic enough way in enough countries. In addition, there is a well-known limitation with these surveys in that the incomes and consumption of the very richest people in a country or globally are underrepresented in household budget surveys like this. And this has been a real problem in economics, and it's one of the reasons that for a long time the extent of income inequality and wealth inequality was underestimated in the world, because all of the estimates were based on these household surveys. And it tends to be that the very richest people either don't report in these surveys at all, or if they do, they tend to be a bit coy about the type of, the level of income that they have and how they spend that money. So this is a good method, but it's not seen as a reliable way of understanding what is happening at the very top of the income distribution. So as a result, we and others have developed a so-called top-down method. And Oxfam was part of one of the early efforts for doing this. Also, similar work was underway by Thomas Piketty, that many of you will know, one of the most famous economists in the world, and his colleagues at the Paris School of Economics, notably Lucas Chancel, and we've been sort of also collaborating with them. And we developed this top-down method to complement the bottom-up approaches. And in this top-down method, what we do is we take much more reliable data on income distributions in all countries around the world. And we assume that there is a certain relationship, which is proven based on these bottom-up studies, between the income that somebody earns and the emissions footprints that they will have. And so we're starting with this much more accurate picture of income distribution in different countries around the world. We build up a picture of the emissions distribution in each country on that basis. And then we are able to resort the emissions into a single global distribution from the richest people on the planet, wherever they live, down to the poorest people on the planet, wherever they live. So these are two complementary but different approaches to trying to understand how emissions are distributed among people around the world, between richer and poorer people in whichever country they happen to live. And so some of these papers are ones that I authored when I was at Oxfam, and some of those were published last year. I'll talk about those in a moment. And then I'll bring you up to date with our newest work as well. So these were the products that we published last year. We did this work as Oxfam together with the Stockholm Environment Institute. We published a long sort of technical research report which goes into lots of detail about the method. And we also made publicly available the full data set that lies behind our estimates that I'm going to present to you in a moment. And then we published a couple of slightly more accessible, shorter policy reports called Confronting Carbon Inequality and Confronting Carbon Inequality in the European Union, which can also give you a flavor of the headline results and how we framed them in terms of the policy recommendations that we are seeking. So that's some of the work that we did last year. And these were the headline results from that work. As I say, what we're doing here is we are attributing the emissions to individuals around the world. All global emissions get attributed to individuals. And we are then sorting that from the richest people on the planet to the poorest people in whichever country they happen to live. And what we saw over this period between 1990 and 2015, which is a period in which the climate crisis really accelerated. Bear in mind that there were about the same emissions were added to the atmosphere in this 25-year period as were added in the entire period from the start of the Industrial Revolution up to that point. So it was a huge acceleration in the climate crisis during just this 25 years. And what we're able to show is that the emissions which were added to the atmosphere, so the cumulative emissions during this period, were overwhelmingly associated with the consumption of the richest people on the planet. So we see that the richest 10% of people on the planet were responsible for over half, 52% of global emissions, and that the richest 1% alone were responsible for about 15%, which is in our estimates, more than double the emissions of the poorest 50% of the global population combined. And we can also see what those cumulative emissions meant in terms of the global carbon budget for the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, so that the emissions associated with the consumption of the richest 10% of people were responsible for depleting that carbon budget for 1.5 degrees by about a third, by 31% in just those 25 years. So it's a huge acceleration of the climate crisis in this period. And it is the massive emissions in this period are overwhelmingly associated with the consumption of a very rich minority of people. Certainly the richest 10% responsible for over half, and within that, the richest 1%, a major driver of more than contributing more than twice the emissions of the poorest half of the global population combined. People always want to know, well, how rich do you need to be in the richest, say, 10% globally, the richest 1%? So to give you a sense, in PPP terms, the richest 10% in 2015 was earning around about 38,000 US dollars per year. So in euros, anywhere around the 40,000 euro mark. If you're earning that in income per year, you're going to be in the richest 10% of the global population, more or less. And for the richest 1%, it's about $104,000. Basically, if you're over 100,000 euros per year, you're probably getting into the richest 1% of people on the planet. So the global population is around 7 billion. So there's about approximately 700 million people in the richest 10% and just 70 million people. So certainly less than the population of Germany in that richest 1%. So it's a tiny fraction of the global population with a completely outsized contribution to global emissions. So this is what we mean when we talk about extreme carbon inequality. Another way to look at it is to say that the richest 10% of people on the planet contribute about the same emissions as the rest of the world combined, and that the richest 1% alone are responsible for more than twice the emissions of the poorest 50% combined. This is extreme carbon inequality. This is the reflection. This is the injustice of climate change. And then, of course, taken alongside this, as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that those poorest 50%, not only do they contribute the least, they are also overwhelmingly affected worst by the impacts of the crisis as well. Now, that's the work that we did last year. There's more as well that could be said about it, but those were the headlines. What we've done this year is to look ahead to 2030 based on the NDCs. These are the nationally determined contributions of countries to the Paris Agreement. So these are the emission reduction pledges that governments have made under the Paris Agreement to reduce their emissions by 2030. And as any of you that have been following the COP26 will know, the big question of the COP was whether or not emissions can be reduced quickly enough by 2030 to keep alive the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, the most ambitious temperature goal being the 1.5 degrees, which means 1.5 degrees of average global warming above pre-industrial levels. And this is the target that the most vulnerable countries fought hard for in Paris and had recognized in the agreement. So do we still have a chance of keeping global heating to that 1.5 degree level? In order to do so, global temperatures need to be at a certain level in 2030. If they're higher than that, then basically there is no chance of a pathway that reduces emissions quickly enough down to net zero in order to limit warming to that level. So we know that we need to hit this level of annual global emissions in 2030 to keep alive the 1.5 degree target. And there has been lots of analysis published during the COP of whether or not the NDCs and the other emission reduction pledges that are being made by governments, whether they are sufficient to limit global warming to that 1.5 degree level. So what we wanted to do was to say, based on the NDCs, based on the emission reduction pledges that have been made by governments, what is this likely to mean for global carbon inequality in 2030? To do this, we have to make a few assumptions. So we assume that there is full implementation of these unconditional pledges that are made by governments, because some governments have said, well, we will make these reductions if we receive a certain amount of climate finance. So we've been a bit conservative and said, yes, you get full implement. We assume that governments that have made unconditional pledges fully implement those pledges. We then assume as well that there are some marginal changes to the inequality of income within countries between now and 2030, which is not very far away anyway. And we assume that there's no major change to trading patterns between countries between now and 2030 as well. So a few assumptions, and we should take it with a pinch of salt. It's not a projection, but it is an estimate of the extent of inequality that we still expect to see even in 2030. And these are some of the headline results. So here we're showing the per capita emissions of these different global income groups in 2030 based on the emission reductions that governments have made. So based on those emission reductions, we are suggesting that the richest 1% of the global population will barely reduce their emissions at all between 2015 and 2030. That their emissions in 2030, we think, will still be 25% higher than they were in 1990, and that they're going to be some 30 times higher than the global per capita level, the global per person level needed in 2030 in order to keep alive this 1.5 degree temperature goal. For the richest 10%, we think that their per capita emissions are going to be some 10 times, nearly 10 times higher than are needed in 2030. For the middle 40% of the global population, you can think of this as the global middle class, they are still going to be slightly higher, about double where they need to be in 2030. Very importantly, the poorest half of the global population are still going to have per capita footprints which are far below that level. And this, again, is the inequality that what we see here is that actually the majority, half the global population will have per person emissions, per capita emissions, which are far below the level which is needed in 2030. So they're not the problem. The problem is all of us that are in the richest 10% or richest 1% who will have still in 2030, despite the emission reduction pledges of governments, will still have footprints, emissions footprints, which are far in excess of what is needed in order to limit global heating to the 1.5 degree target. So that's looking at per capita emissions in 2030. If we then, instead of thinking about the per person emissions, we think about the total emissions associated with those global income groups, then this is the picture. And here we see that the poorest 90% of the population, if we put together the total emissions associated with all of those people in those income groups, they are only just above the total global level that we need to be at in 2030. So almost 90% of the global population is in line with where we need to be by 2030. They're not really the problem. The problem is that the richest 10% alone have total emissions which nearly meet that level that is needed globally in 2030. So again, it's impossible to keep alive the 1.5 degree target unless we do something dramatic to reduce the massively outsized contribution of the richest people on the planet, which includes many of us, by the way. When we think about it in terms of the total share of emissions associated with the different income groups, so that you see in this graphic, in the middle circle shows the share of the population from the richest 1% through to the poorest 50%. And then the other circles show the share of total global emissions, first in 1990, then in 2015. And the outer circle shows what we are projecting or estimating it will be the share of emissions in 2030. So what's interesting here is that you see that the richest 1% is estimated to increase their share of total emissions between the Paris Agreement and 2030. So at a time when we're supposed to be in a climate emergency, we're supposed to be doing everything possible to reduce our emissions, we think that the share of total global emissions of the richest 1% is actually going to grow in this period. You can see here a little bit more what we're suggesting will be the change in per capita emissions of the different global income groups compared to what is needed to align with the global average per capita level in 2030 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So for the richest 1%, we expect them to reduce their emissions by about 5% by 2030, when what they need to do is to reduce emissions by 97%. So they're way off track. For the richest 10%, we expect them to reduce emissions by about 11%, but they need 90% reductions. And at the other end of the scale, whereas we're estimating that you will get a growth in per capita emissions of the poorest 50% of the global population. In part, that's because we've only assumed unconditional emission reductions are implemented. If you had financing to, in particular countries in Africa, they want to have much more ambitious emission reductions. They just make it dependent on receipt of financing. But even if they grew 17%, which is what we are estimating they might grow by 2030, they're still way underneath the level that would be compatible with the 1.5 degree target. They could grow 200% and still not exceed that average global per capita level. And this is just another way of looking at how we expect the pledges of emission reductions that have been made by governments, what that will do to the distribution of global emissions between people. So these, in this graph, we are showing the distribution of emissions from the richest on the right-hand side through to the poorest on the left-hand side of the horizontal axis. And you can see with the yellow line, this is the shape of the emissions growth associated with different parts of the global income distribution between 1990 and 2015. And so you saw very rapid growth in emissions, per capita emissions in the global middle classes. These are the people, billions of people particularly in China and in India, other middle income countries who are seeing very rapid improvements in their income and therefore their consumption and therefore their emissions during this period. So that's why you get the fastest per capita emissions growth rates in the global middle classes between 1990 and 2015. And one of the things that is striking is that we expect that to completely reverse. So going from very rapid per capita emissions growth in the global middle classes, we expect to see almost no growth through to 2030. So that's a very rapid turnaround. And it shows that the Paris Agreement is having an effect. It's not like these emission reductions don't mean anything. It's just that it's not enough, and that it's not yet reducing emissions sufficiently, particularly amongst the richest people on the planet, where we need to see the deepest reductions. I'm going to skip over this one for now, and I'm just going to go into have a final slide here looking at the inequality, not globally now, but within countries. So we can look at this inequality between the richest and poorest people wherever they live on the planet, but we can also zoom in and look at the inequality between richer and poorer citizens within a particular country. And here we're comparing the emissions of richer and poorer citizens in 5 countries, so China, USA, EU, UK, and India, just to give you a flavor of how rich and poor people in different countries can compare to one another. And one of the things that you'll see is that the richest citizens in the EU, UK, India all have similar footprints by 2030, we expect. But what is noticeable is that the emissions, even of the poorest 50% in China, are still going to be within that global per capita level we need to hit by 2030, although they will have some citizens in China who are way, way above it. And in the EU and UK, we think that the poorest citizens, the poorest 50% of people in European countries, in the UK, will be very close to, if not below, the level that we need to hit globally by 2030. The problem is that even in countries like the UK and the EU, we will still have some of the richest citizens in our countries who are way above that level. So in all countries, we have work to do to reduce the emissions of the richest, who are pushing all of us beyond the level of emissions which is needed to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. Where do these emissions come from of the very richest people? It does vary, of course, between countries. There are various factors at play. But one thing that is consistent is that the emissions, very high footprints of the world's richest, highest emitters overwhelmingly come from transport. Transport is the most unequal source of carbon consumption. What do people spend their money on as they get richer? They spend it on bigger cars, driving them further, and in particular, they spend it on flying. That's why, you know, flying is an incredibly elite form of luxury carbon consumption. And it's responsible for a very large share of the footprints of the world's richest, highest emitters. I would say that in particular this year, we saw a lot of attention, not just on even the richest 1%, which, remember, these are people with incomes over, say, 100,000 euros per year, but on, and even, you know, the top 0.001%, the billionaires of the world. And of course, minds, I think, were focused in particular because of the space race, the advent of space tourism with, you know, billionaires going into space. And of course, Jeff Bezos was there at the COP in particular, imparting some kind of wisdom to the world about how to fight the climate crisis. So there was a lot of attention in particular on the role of billionaires. What kind of footprints do billionaires have? And of course, they've got massively outsized footprints. There was a study from last year. This shows some of the results, looking just at a few aspects of billionaire consumption and what their footprints might look like. And they're just on another scale altogether, on a completely different order of magnitude, even compared to, say, the richest 1%. You know, absolutely obscene footprints in the thousands of tons of carbon per year. But the important thing as well is to remember that actually these footprints are not just about their direct consumption, the things that they spend their money on, but it's about their investments, it's about their political power, their influence, their role in potentially blocking more progressive climate legislation, and also their role as role models, you know, showing sort of what many people would aspire to, which is, you know, a lifestyle built on ever more wealth, ever more consumption, ever more conspicuous consumption. And in a sense, although of course these are huge footprints on a per capita basis, you might say, well, I mean, you know, even if you got rid of billionaires and got rid of their footprints, you know, it still wouldn't solve the climate crisis. Certainly it wouldn't. But of course, there is I would say, a very strong argument that If we are to expect people in the global middle classes, even people in middle classes in rich countries like here in Europe, if we're to expect changes to lifestyles, changes to the consumption patterns of people in middle classes, it is very difficult to build the social solidarity needed while there are conspicuously very highly rich, very highly powerful individuals that clearly have carbon footprints way in excess of anybody else. So it's important to look at the role of these very highly emitting individuals and how we can seek to address that as part of our global efforts to build solidarity in addressing the climate crisis. And that's what we've seen a lot, in particular in the reaction to the work this year. There's been a lot more focus on the role of billionaires, on the role of their investments, on their obscene wealth, and in particular the emergence of a lot of calls now for wealth taxes as a form of climate policy. And you don't have to go back many years before, 5 years ago, nobody thought about the idea of a wealth tax as a form of climate policy. Climate policy was very much focused on addressing, technological shift of how we produce energy from fossil fuels to renewables. And that's obviously still the central challenge in tackling the climate crisis. But now we also see a much clearer joining between climate policy and social policy. And if I've understood correctly from your program, there are sessions on this in later in the week, because I think this is very important, that we are now seeing many more analysts, researchers, commentators that are starting to say, look, if we want to address the climate crisis, we can only do that if we also redress the stark inequalities in emissions footprints, in wealth, in income around the world. Only a fairer world is a world that is likely to be able to tackle the climate crisis. And in particular, as I say, there's a surge in interest around wealth taxes as a really critical part of the climate policy toolkit. There's been a big debate over in the States. They tried to pass a billionaire tax that eventually fell away, but it made a lot of headway. There are calls for European wealth taxes, which are out there, which I think are really interesting. I expect those to continue to gather steam in the UK. We see members of parliament putting down amendments for increases in top income taxes explicitly linked to some of the research that we have been publishing related to their very outsized footprints. This ICRIT group of experts on taxation in Europe have been explicitly calling for wealth taxes, again, to address the climate crisis. So this focus on taxation of the richest, the wealthiest in society being a critical component is something that I expect to grow. And some of those other examples I just shared were very much from a lot of white men. And so I also wanted to make sure that, we're platforming here voices of more marginalized communities. The Alliance for a Green New Deal is another very good source of information, somewhere to go and have a look. Their declaration for a Green New Deal similarly centers very much on the need for fairer systems of taxation as a central component to fighting the climate crisis, addressing inequality both within and between countries, and focusing resources on the communities and places around the world where they're needed most. And I just finished now with a few final thoughts about some of the wider policy agenda, just to leave you with a few other suggestions of what are the policy levers that governments could try to pull if they wanted to address these very stark inequalities around the world. Clearly there are measures then in the top left that would be just designed to address the activities which are associated with very high income, high emitting individuals. Wouldn't affect anybody else, whether these are measures related to aviation, whether they are frequent flyer taxes or even bans, things. Why do we have private jets? In a climate emergency, perhaps governments should just be banning them outright. SUVs, sports utility vehicles, particularly for a German audience, where you guys, coming from a country that has, frankly, an obsession with ever bigger cars, driving them ever faster, is hugely polluting and associated really in global terms with a very small minority of the world's richest people. Do we really need those? How can we start to crack down on them? Do we start to tax them? Can we start to just ban them altogether, or create at least some incentives for manufacturers to stop producing ever heavier, ever more polluting cars. Of course, there are things like cruise ships and yachts and all sorts of policies there, policies related to multiple homes or the types of investments that people hold in fossil fuel stocks and so on. These are sets of policies there that governments could look at that would just directly target the emissions of the super rich. Then there are, of course, a set of policies that could be explored that would support emission reductions while also benefiting those on lower incomes. So investments in public transport, investments in energy efficiency improvements, reskilling, trainings, all of these things that would help to narrow the gap between rich and poor while also cutting emissions. There's a key debate around taxation, as I mentioned, different forms of carbon pricing, different forms of carbon taxation, wealth taxation, and ways to design this such that it would actually be progressive. It would redistribute income from richer to poorer if the revenues are properly used and directed to those on lower incomes. And then beyond all of this, if we wanted to go really big picture, what is really driving this model of stark inequality around the world, which is contributing to the climate crisis so dramatically? One can start to address those foundations of the economic model which drives such extreme inequality, that is reliant on consumption-driven, endless, limitless growth. And then, of course, there's lots of debate about alternative economic models around well-being economics or donut economics, and so on, and an increasingly, I would say, rich debate about the types of policies which are needed to address those very foundations, whether that's about requiring companies to produce goods which can be repaired, supporting a repair economy rather than encouraging, incentivizing people always to buy something new, thinking about different types of business models and how to support those so that they're less driven by relentless growth in profits and shareholder dividends and more concerned about other metrics, ways of measuring other things than GDP growth and getting governments to think about other priorities. So lots and lots of rich thinking around that. And all of those ideas really speak to what we're showing in this research, which is there is something broken in our economic model in that it produces extreme levels of inequality, and those extreme levels of inequality in turn are associated with an outsized contribution to ecological breakdown. And so if we care about the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, then we have to get serious about tackling this inequality at root. That's what we're trying to show with the research. It's had, I think, a lot of pickup, in particular from youth, the climate movements. Greta and other leaders in the Fridays for Future movement have always been supportive and used this work, and I hope that it's useful also to those of you that are coming into this debate, and we're really happy to have a dialogue about how this research can be useful in your campaigns, in your advocacy, and very happy to take any questions or reflections that you might have. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. It was very great to hear who has the most emissions and so on, and who has this big impact on our climate. So we not have this much time left, but I want to ask you one question which came in, and it is, are the emissions of the richest only caused by their consumption, or are the emissions also caused by their shares in industry and economy? Are these emissions also included?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we assume here that these footprints are a reflection of, as you say, somebody's consumption, which would generally be, particularly for lower income citizens, that would be the vast majority of their footprints. But as you move up the income distribution, then a bigger share of somebody's emissions footprints are associated not only with their direct consumption, but also with what the money that they are saving or investing is doing as well. And so, yes, that is also reflecting the footprint associated with the investments, capital investments, in particular of the world's richest people.
Okay, then maybe one question left before I would ask to you if you want to give an end statement for the audience. Do we, as the maybe normal people is not the best word, but what can we do to influence these people maybe, and to lower the emissions in the whole?
Yeah, I think firstly, recognizing the extreme inequality that's driving the climate crisis is the first step. Knowing that, even forget all of this research for a moment, just keep in mind that the entire African continent is only responsible for about 3% of global emissions, right? The entire African continent. I mean, that's the, this is the inequality. It's very hard for us, I think, to even really comprehend, the scale of the inequality behind this climate crisis. So the first thing is to really get your head around that, really, accept it and talk about it so explicitly in those terms, because when it comes to then the policy debate, and you see how vulnerable country governments were fighting in Glasgow for tiny sums of money, to support them to address the climate crisis. We've got to keep that in mind, that it's so unequally driven, this crisis. And so I think firstly, just really internalizing that, being prepared to talk about it, being prepared to talk about just how extreme this inequality is, because that underpins the types of responses that are needed, whether those are responses within our own countries or at the international level. So that would be the first thing. And then I think, being prepared to engage with the policy solutions which also go beyond pure traditional climate policy. This isn't a crisis which will be solved solely by transitioning energy systems from fossil fuels to renewables. Obviously, we need to do that, but it's so much more than that. We need to make sure that this is part of a broader progressive transition in our societies. That means that when climate movements, when you're planning your activism, when you're planning your strategies, not to only focus on those traditional climate policies, but also think about, do we need to advocate for wealth taxes? Do we need to advocate for more progressive income taxation in our countries? What are the wider policies? What are the wider reflections that we need to have about the society that we live in, and that we need something that is fairer as a prerequisite for addressing the climate crisis? Those, I think, are the ways that you need to start thinking about what this research means for all of us in our work as climate activists.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation and for your answers to these questions. Then I would just ask to you if you want to leave last comments to the audience before we have to go off, and then the next presentation will start in a few minutes. Yes, it's your turn.
No, I said really a lot, but please feel free to get in touch. I don't think I left my email, but find it through the school in some way, or get in touch on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever. Feel free to reach out if we can support in some way, or follow up with any questions. But most important, take the extent of this inequality forward as you think about how to address this climate crisis. So don't be afraid to talk about it, and don't be afraid to advocate for the kinds of policies that would be really needed to get to the root causes of these inequalities. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here today. We're going off now, and the next presentation will start in a few minutes then. Thank you.